All right, it is 5:30 on the 21st of May. Thank you everyone for joining us at the CRA briefing session where we are going to discuss the third iteration of South Africa's national budget, presented earlier today by the Minister of Finance, Minister Enoch Godongwana. Thank you all for accommodating our various time changes as more details had emerged regarding President Ramaphosa's upcoming meeting with President Trump in the White House. We tried to shift things around a little bit so that you can all also get to following developments in Washington as those happen. On that note, I should also remind everyone we will do another briefing session tomorrow morning at 10:30 at 10:30, discussing the fallout, positive or negative or both, from the Ramaphosa-Trump meeting. So please do RSVP for that as well and join us. So to get into today's discussion, my name is Chris Hutton. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis. Joining me, our main speaker today, unpacking the third budget, Anlu Kiefer, a researcher at the Institute of Race Relations. Also joining us, Mr. Nicholas Lorimer, host of the Daily Friend Show and geopolitics researcher. You can save all your questions around what's going to happen in the Trump-Ramaphosa meeting for Nick, and we'll get into that in the Q&A after we discuss the budget. Regarding just a few housekeeping matters, the webinar, the discussion will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on YouTube. It'll also be sent to our clients after today's session is finished. As to questions and items for discussion, please post those in the comment box on the respective platform on which you are watching, and we will then get to those as at the end of Anlu's presentation. And we'll put some questions on budgets and numbers to Nick as well, just to see how he handles them and how he can deal with budget projections, etc. But there we go. Everything sorted for us, everything in order. Anlu, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through the third budget for 2025. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. And as Chris said, thank you to every one of you for joining us. We know there's a lot happening at the moment, but yeah, thank you for making time to join us as we try and make sense of the third iteration of the budget. That alone should stop us in our tracks. But yeah, this budget is in many ways was and is a make or break budget. Either it would have restored a measure of order and set us up for a future of better budgets, or it can, without giving anything away to those who have not yet looked at it, it can confirm that we've crossed into something entirely different. Anything on the spectrum from fiscal paralysis to political breakdown or a crisis of confidence. But yeah, so you've joined us today. We're going to cut through the headlines. We're going to look at what has changed, what hasn't, and yeah, whether Treasury has had to face some of those scans that they've been kicking down the road so many times. So let's start. I want to begin with a couple of reasons why the first two budgets failed. I suppose everyone remembers the 2% VAT, the first iteration of the budget, then the 0.5% for this year and 0.5% for next year. But the VAT issue, in a way, was only the problem that ignited the breakdown. There was already a fire smoldering underneath. So the first thing we need to understand about why the first two budgets failed is that the political math has changed in South Africa. The ANC could no longer push the budget through as they did on their own in previous years, so that changed everything. And instead of carefully negotiating the first budget and in the second budget, they would just push through as they used to do, full bulldozer method, and that approach backfired. There was obviously merit in opposing the VAT that was suggested in both the previous budgets, because South Africans just can't carry more tax, and VAT is a very emotive point of contention. So the budget came in as a proxy fight almost over power in Parliament, in the GNU. The DA, I believe, felt shut out or strong-armed on many of the other critical issues or important issues in the GNU. They saw this merit in standing against the VAT. They took the opportunity to then frame the VAT as a symbol of everything else that they were resisting. And then finally, of course, the most important issue is that the deficit doesn't disappear in the budget. If you pull that out of the budget or out of the equation, something else has to give. And for long, the ANC didn't want to be the one to name what gets cut, because as we know, that's obviously their main campaigning issue or point. But yeah, until they now had no choice but to face, as we said, many of those cans that they've been kicking down the road. Wonderful. From there, let's have a look at the third iteration of the budget in a bit more detail. We'll divide it into 5 parts. First, government collects revenue or collects tax. We'll have a look at their revenue. Next, we'll have a look at where and how government reallocated and allocated in the previous 2 budgets these funds. We'll then discuss the gap that this creates when government spends more than they earn, therefore the deficit. We'll have a look to cover this deficit. They often have to resort to borrowing, and that leads to our rising debt levels. And then finally, we'll have a look at how these 4 elements affect the economy and ultimately you. And we'll have a look at how this budget, where the Treasury was willing to make some of those tough trade-offs that we needed them to make. So let's start by looking at government's income. So just to simplify, from here on out, we'll describe budget iteration 2 as just budget 2 and the third one as just budget 3. So budget 2 estimated that they'll collect consolidated budget revenue worth 2.2 trillion rand, of which 2 trillion rand would have been through taxes. The third budget said now it's 2.2 trillion. You'll see on the screen it's a little bit rounded up and down. I've had to include now 2 decimal points just to actually point out the difference there. Budget 3 then said of the 2.2 trillion rand that they'll collect, 1.99 trillion will be through tax revenue. I want to just mention here that the tax burden, which is your tax to GDP ratio essentially, that's expected for this year to average, or for the medium term to average 25.3%, and that's down up 25.5%. That's down from 25.3%. But let's have a look at where this tax comes from. Okay, so to understand this graph, I usually recommend just thinking of it as a tax bucket. It's a government bucket and we need to fill it with taxes. So the graph will show us essentially just what type of tax fills the bucket. Individuals, first on the list, they pay personal income tax. That puts roughly 790 billion rand in the government's budget bucket. Companies contribute a further 340 billion. Now notice that we've already crossed the halfway mark in the bucket. So individuals and companies fill up the bucket 60%. Then we have value-added tax that contributes roughly 480 billion rand. I want to just stand still here for a moment. For budget 2, Treasury proposed that they'll increase by 0.5 for 2025 and 0.6 for 2026. And that would have raised 28 billion rand this year and 14.5 billion rand next year. We knew that that was unlikely in the first case. They probably didn't fully account for the second order effects. But okay, so for budget 3, there's no VAT increase. VAT stays at 15%. And they've removed the 0-rated items, the additional ones that they would have added to compromise for the negative effects of the VAT increase. So VAT will now, for 2025, they estimate contribute 480 billion rand. And then finally, we have our smaller taxes, your custom duties and fuel levies, which we'll get to at a later stage, that contributes 372 billion rand. Why is it important to understand where tax comes from? It tells us where governments, firstly, it tells us that government heavily relies on, as we saw, the orange and the red. That's your personal income tax and your corporate income tax. So government needs the individuals and the companies to do well to actually increase their tax revenue. So if they don't do well, then revenue gets hit. And now knowing that government so heavily depends on individuals and companies, individuals specifically, we're going to zoom in a little bit and have a look at who are the people that pay personal income tax. let's start. So this slide will show us who pays personal income tax and how much they pay. There's almost 10 million taxpayers who earn less than 250,000 Rand a year, and they contribute 4.9%, let's call it 5% of personal income tax. The next group, that consists of about 3.5 million taxpayers. They earn between 250 and 750,000 Rand a year, and they contribute a further 35% to personal income tax. And then finally, the smallest group here, 980,000 people who earn more than 750,000 Rand, they contribute 60% of all personal income tax. So if you step back a little bit and you just have a look at the bigger picture of what you see here, you will see that 31%, let's see, I have my pointer here. Just want to coordinate here. I hope you can see my pointer on the screen. On the left corner, the yellow and orange, you'll see that 31% of taxpayers contribute 95% of all personal income tax. That is the yellow and the orange on the right-hand side. And this is exactly what we call a narrow tax base and why it's so difficult for Treasury essentially to increase the revenue that they collect, because they're so heavily dependent on a specific group of people. So now let's move on to see how Treasury actually allocated and reallocated these funds that they've collected. Being the third attempt at the budget, Treasury had some difficult trade-offs that they had to make. So when we have a look at where the money goes, keep in mind that yes, tax is a cost to the individual, but the actual cost to the taxpayer is how government decides to spend that money. Okay, so why are we looking at how they spend money? It's because it's important because it tells us where government's priorities lie. So firstly, budget 2, main government expenditure, that's just primarily funded through tax, that we just had a look at. That was estimated to be 2.32 trillion Rand. It is now down to 2.31 trillion Rand, and you'll see why I included 2 decimals. It's not a big revision. Obviously, in trillions it is big, but okay. Then if you include additional spending, like your public entities or your funds, then budget 2 estimated 2.59 trillion Rand, and we are now at 2.58 trillion Rand. I want to mention that they estimate that this expenditure will grow at previous budget 5.6% annually, now 5.4% annually. So yeah, despite the fiscal pressure that we're under, spending is still growing at a rate almost 5 times the rate at which our economy is growing. Is growing. Thank you. Okay, so question here is, where is the money going? Let's have a look. Let's break it down in 4 main categories. The focus here is not so much the shift between between the yellow and the red bars, but let's first focus on just the red bars. The larger share of spending, nearly 60%, goes towards social spending. That includes your grants, your healthcare, education, yeah. Thereafter, you'll have your general public services and state debt costs. That's an estimated 21%. Then we have economic and environment expenditure. That's just over 11% of the main budget. And finally, we have our defense and safety spending. And the reason I'm showing you this is firstly if you then have a look at 1994 until now, you'll see there's a definite shift away from defense a little bit towards social spending, which increased quite a bit. Okay, so why am I showing you this? It's almost a zoomed out view of what government has prioritized. And as I said, it's clearly social spending. But the reason I pointed out is in terms of long-term priority changes. So let's zoom in now, and then we'll have a look at this budget and the next year. So before you feel overwhelmed, this graph seems complicated, but we're going to stand still here for a moment. I have my pointer here again. I hope you can see it on the screen. So let's start with the red bar at the bottom. You'll see that government spends the most on education. That's 19.4% of all expenditure. Then the second largest one is the light yellow. You'll see over there. That's 16.8% of expenditure. And I usually say that the saying goes that there's nothing as permanent as a temporary state grant, and we're an excellent example of this. And then, we next move to the top bar. There at the top, the grey one, our debt servicing cost, that accounts for 16.5% of our expenditure. Notice that it is grey. This is not a coincidence. Money spent on debt servicing costs is essentially debt money. It can't be used productively. And this is especially important because we can see this grey bar, especially starting here, pushing down on the other areas of expenditure. And this is what we call the crowding out effect. And you can see it's competing for funding with many of these other spending areas. So if government's not careful, within the next year or two, it is likely to surpass our budget for education. Okay, so then we will move on. We'll have a look at some of the risks to the fiscus. I'm going to list them all out. I'm not going to go through them individually. Happy to discuss some of them afterwards. On this list, some noteworthy items include the budget allocations or the lack thereof for the Expropriation Act, National Health Insurance, the Basic Income Grant, currently under the SRD grant, but there's been many instances in which they indicated that they would like to change this into a basic income grant. It is due to end next year, March, I believe, if I'm right. Then we have the public sector wage bill. There's still a 5.5% increase. That's a 7.3 billion rand increase for this financial year. Still municipal debts, specifically listed here as Eskom. Municipalities owe Eskom 109 billion rand. That, just as interesting, is 18 times more than what municipalities owed Eskom in 2015. Absolutely mind-boggling. Then we have SOE bailouts. We have the infrastructure drive. We've now heard that it's 1 trillion rand over the next 3 years. And then, finally, very important, as long as the government keeps running up debt, our debt levels, and we have a stagnating economy, we can't afford those debt levels. And the question mark will remain over the ability of the state to actually repay their lenders. And the lenders will essentially demand steep returns to compensate for this risk. And all these pressures weigh on the budget. It brings us to our earlier point that government has, in this budget, tried to face some of those cans that they've kicked, but we don't see them making those very, very necessary trade-offs in the policy arena yet. Let's have a look. I want just a quick recap. We've had a look at revenue. We've had a look at expenditure. We've seen that they still continue to spend more than we collect. And this is what brings us to our deficit. So let's have a look at the deficit here. The second budget estimated to have a 4.6% deficit. This is consolidated spending. And it is now at 4.8%. And for our primary surplus, Treasury continues to focus on the primary surplus. They've again confirmed this as their means to stabilize our debt. So that means that, just quicker, primary surplus is before we spend any money on repaying our interest on our debt, we have enough money to pay for our day-to-day expenditure. For 2023, we had a 0.5% primary balance. Last year, the same, and this year now they say revised 0.7%. So let's have a look at where the deficit has come from since 1994. Okay, going to stand still here for a second again. First, the yellow bars, that's our revenue. Then we add these red bars, that is our expenditure. I'm going to pull up my indicator here. You'll see that the red bars are consistently higher than the yellow bars. The only time it is not is right over here between 2006 and 2008, and that is under the leadership of Trevor Manuel. Then we'll add another line, a black line here. and that shows us where we've had a deficit or a surplus. Just make a mental note that it uses the right-hand axis, so draw a invisible line there at the 0, and you'll see that right over here, 2006, 2008, that is the only time that the black line is above the 0%, so essentially a surplus indication. Yeah. Then we'll shift our attention to the far right. These are our forecasts. You'll see that these are the current revised estimates for the budget at a 4.6% deficit for this year. And then the medium-term outlook, just as an interesting point, it has now improved to 3.4% deficit. Okay, so to remind you of what we said in the beginning, to cover this deficit, government needs to borrow in many instances, and they have over the past. But let's have a look at our rising debt levels. So the second budget estimated that our borrowing requirement will be 582 billion rand. It is now at 588 billion rand. Our debt to GDP, they forecasted to stabilize at 76.2%. We're now at 77.4%. Still for this year, they have not moved that out. And then our debt servicing cost was first estimated for 425 billion rand. We are now at 426 billion rand. I included this because I think it's important to get firstly context on the country's debt, but also to understand whether if Treasury says they will stabilize, whether there's any credibility in that, because we know there's been a long-standing ambition to stabilize our debt. So National Treasury first communicated their intention to stabilize our debt in 2010-11. Since then, so first they said that they will stabilize in 2015-16. They've now changed it 10 times. They have not revised it for this last year. For the budget 2 said this year, budget 3 still says this year, but it has changed 10 times. And then also the level at which they said it will stabilize has changed 14 times. Again, not between budget 2 and 3, but it has changed 14 times. Okay, so now I want to take us back a bit so that we can have a look at where we started with our debt and where we are now. At the start of our democratic era, our debt was around 50% of GDP. You'll see there a solid 50%. Come 2007-08, as I mentioned, under the leadership of, I think, Trevor Manuel's second budget, you'll see that we have now halved our debt to GDP ratio. And then since then, we have managed to triple it to what will this year be 77.4%. And this is an excellent example of how over the last decade, government has been unwilling to, they've been kicking the cans, and they've been unwilling to make those tough trade-offs. They've resorted to borrowing in many instances. And then, of course, relying on heavier borrowing and our low growth is not a good combination. So our debt servicing cost, as I mentioned, has been revised. It is roughly 1.2 billion rand per day. That's the equivalent of 22 cents for every rand of tax that you pay. But I often find it difficult to think of what 22 cents can really do, but I know what I can do with 220 rand. And every 1,000 rand that you pay in tax, 220 rand of that is that grey debt spending. So why does this matter? The main reason is that the more debt we have, the less we have available for other services. And just the point that this is not what austerity looks like. I know the minister made a point of it to say that this budget is not an austerity budget, but we need austerity. We need to see spending cuts. So yeah, once more with enthusiasm, these are not the tough trade-offs. There were some trade-offs, but not the tough ones we needed. Okay, those are just our forecasts for the next 2 years, if you notice on the right-hand side. It's a little bit down, but that's essentially the level at which it will stabilize. Okay, so what can we take away? Let me take it's a mouthful. It's quite a bit here. Okay, important The budget made some commitments to reviewing spending, more than the usual rhetoric, I'd say. But we have to keep in mind that volatility, both domestic political uncertainty and the global uncertainty that we currently have, it just breeds investor nervousness. And that will still affect our investment levels. So the important question we need to ask is, does this budget signal enough commitment to long-term stability to mean that we'll see something like a credit rating upgrade? It's currently, S&P said it's positive outlook, but will that mean a full-on upgrade? And this is a rhetorical question to some extent, but an important one. Then global trade has already started off much more volatile this year, which means central banks will be more nervous and inflation may stay higher for longer, which means that it'll take us longer for our interest rates to come down, and then our debt servicing costs remain higher for longer. And we definitely cannot afford that at this stage. Just something to keep in mind. Then domestic politics have, over the past couple of months, 3 or so months, since the first budget, put a lot of pressure on our fiscus. We've had to do 3 iterations to get to this point, and we still need to see this get passed, but I believe that's safe to assume that it, fingers crossed, hopefully will. But we're now on such a tight deadline, timeline-wise, that there's really very little room to make mistakes. And we need to keep in mind that opposition parties has now seen that going to court over disagreements sometimes does the trick. And then very important, the minister mentioned that 2026 budget will propose tax amendments, and there can potentially be some political risks in that again. Hopefully not 3 budgets. So yeah, the point here is that the government remains the biggest risk to the private sector, especially when it comes to investing in national infrastructure, which they desperately want the private sector to do. Yeah. And then finally, if you're a taxpayer, there's little relief in sight. There might not be as much political or additional pain in the immediate future. We've only seen a few levies and a couple of other small adjustments. But for the long run, if we want to see tax relief, Treasury will need to get our debt to GDP ratio from, at the moment, still worsening. And they need to get that under control and get faster economic growth. So, yeah, our focus forward needs to be where government said it is, balancing the budget by having spending efficiency reviews and having stronger revenue collection. We need to see them shifting that perspective almost to one of, we have revenue, we need to spend it better. We don't have a revenue collection problem, we have a spending problem. So yeah, that I believe this budget, all in all, sets us up for better budgets in the future. Perhaps not far enough on making those tough trade-offs, but it definitely shows us how to face some of those scams that we've been kicking down the road. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Chris, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Anlu, taking us through the third budget for this year. You've had your time with South Africa's national numbers through the first half of this year. So let's see, as we go into this era of national coalition government, whether in the medium term, but also in next year's full budget, they either continue this trend or maybe they buck the trend. We'll need a chart where we track perhaps number of people in cabinet and number of budgets that are presented every year. That could be quite an interesting graph to see if there's correlation. But Anlu, I'm going to give you a little bit of a break. We already have a few questions. Thank you all very much for that. And another reminder to please share any questions, discussion points you might have, type those in the chat box. Nicholas, I'm going to come to you. I don't know if it's an easy or a difficult question. A good sign for the GNU that there's finally that all the parties in the GNU stood up and applauded. as the minister finished his speech. Yes, the various bills need to be passed, etc. But am I reaching now to say, okay, this is your third attempt now, things are stable from a GNU financial fiscus point of view?
I think probably not. And the reason is that the DA and the ANC are fundamentally opposed to each other on so many political positions. They have completely different ideas about how to implement policy. And this budget was only produced because of this intense political battle between the DA and the ANC. The DA not voting, of course, for the first budget, the ANC recruiting other allies outside the GNU to try and pass the second one. And the end result was eventually, when that didn't work, they've had to do this sort of compromise budget. I was watching some of the DA's reaction to the budget, and they had the what felt like a very workshopped line: "We are cautiously supportive of this bill," and I think that's kind of the place they're at. The GNU is in a very interesting position right now. If you look at how South Africans overall feel, a coalition between the DA and the ANC is pretty popular. It's by far the most popular option for any political arrangement in the country. More than that, the GNU is relatively popular. At least it's considered to be doing a better job than previous governments. Now, I don't know how those numbers are mostly from before the VAT fight, so things may have changed somewhat. But overall, South Africans, the voters, want the GNU to stay in place. And this creates a big problem for both the DA and the ANC. The ANC clearly does not want the DA to have input on its budget or on its policy in general. And the DA doesn't want to be in an arrangement in a government where they don't have the say that they want to have to actually implement some of their own policies. But the voters want them to be in this arrangement. So this budget, I think, is exactly a product of that very uncomfortable marriage. This is a marriage where both of the partners are sort of desperate for divorce. They may be cheating on each other. It's all a bit of a mess. But it's just too financially and reputationally damaging for either of them to actually go through with the divorce. So they're sitting here unhappily together, trying to make it work as best they can. And I think what Anlu said at the end there, that this isn't a great budget, but it sort of sets us up for future budgets is key. One of the wins the DA is championing is they say that they managed to get the idea of a spending review, particularly focusing on ghost employees, pushed through with this budget. They also talked up the infrastructure spending. Now, this is, infrastructure spending is very politically easy. Everyone kind of likes that. You slosh money around. Everyone likes to see it because it's roads and it's ports and it's rails. And it's true, South Africa does need more spending on its infrastructure, but more importantly, it needs effective spending on its infrastructure. And unfortunately, I think we're probably not going to get that at the moment. The situation, due to various cost inflating policies like BEE, due to rampant corruption within government, that infrastructure spending is not going to be great bang for buck, unfortunately. So I think, when you hear 1 trillion rand or whatever the exact figure is on infrastructure spending, it's really not going to be that in reality. But it is something that kind of everyone can agree on. So it's a rare point of sort of meeting of the minds here. And the spending review is going to be key, because if the next budget is just the same as this one, if costs refuse to be cut, if you once again are faced with having to raise taxes or increase the debt burden, or one of the awful consequences, then we really haven't made any progress. And I see in the sort of forecast, there's this sort of assumption that there's going to be this extra 20 billion rand in revenue in the next budget. The spending review is the only way, I think, to avoid that. And so that's going to be a key tool here. Is the spending review effective? Does it actually find waste, of which I believe there is a very significant amount in government, particularly when it comes to corruption-related problems? And if so, if that waste is found, is it actually acted on? It's all good and well to point out all of the problems. The Zondo Commission did a great job of this. But at the end of the day, if you don't actually make the changes that are demanded by this, you don't get anywhere. So Yeah, a disappointing budget in the fact that I don't think it actually moves us towards the economic growth, towards the responsible government spending that we desperately need. But it could have been much worse. And despite the increase in debt, I think overall for most South Africans, this is probably a slightly better budget than the previous two we've had. Well, that remains to be seen. I think how things kind of play out. As for the politics of this, it does look like the GNU will kind of hold together now, sort of in this very dysfunctional way. Heads have cooled, and both sides have been sniping at each other slightly less aggressively. Especially the DA has been much quieter. The ANC, I think, is still quite upset. But we'll see how that unfolds. And I suspect that within a month or two, we're going to have another crisis in the GNU as the parties fall out over something. Will that break it down? Well, if the first budget rejection didn't break the GNU, one wonders whether anything actually will. Maybe it's just going to continue like this for years to come. We'll have to see.
As of this afternoon, the rand was below 18 to the dollar. So for those of you who've been holding off on buying some dollars, now might be that time, because it could very quickly weaken to above 18, 19 again. So I would like to mention that in the context of what Nicholas said, that sort of internal turbulence is probably going to be a feature of the GNU going forward. Whether they can get together on things like the budget is a good sign in this particular instance. Whether they can do that going forward, I don't think should be taken for granted. So just because it happened today doesn't mean in the budget review or in the medium-term budget, etc., it's just a guarantee. Anlu, coming to you on some of the spending cuts, where, or at least some of the budgets, the sort of forecasts are less than they have been in previous budgets this year. Talking about the impact on local government and service delivery, what are some of the areas where you think those impacts could be biggest? Because, of course, provincial departments, metros, quite a bit of what they rely on is from national government. And when they can't rely on all of or some of those streams, either they tap ratepayers who are already under pressure, including in the biggest metros in Gauteng, in Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni. What do you think of how residents and businesses maybe in some provinces need to prepare for a period of national treasury maybe cutting some elements of that support?
Yeah, we haven't seen any, between budget 2 and budget 3, many of the line items have stayed the same, specifically if you consider allocations toward local and provincial governments. But it is, at the moment, something as simple as the fuel levy. That will certainly have an effect on individuals on a local level. At the moment, we have people having to pay more to go to work. The moment we have more people having to pay more expensive for their levies at home. Even something like the tobacco increase. And that can very simply feed through in the stream of lower tobacco use, not that it necessarily does, but lower tobacco use and lower tax collection on a local level. So in that sense, yeah, I think there's at least no immediate pressure on provincial governments to redo the entire budget and have to re-go through the entire system. There's likely to be 1 or 2 small changes, but as far as I understand, there will not be. It's not necessary to have a whole new budget speech for each provincial department, and I'm convinced that they're very happy about that. Because if you consider just the fact, I thought of it earlier when I was listening to Minister Enoch Godongwana speaking. Many of those National Treasury employees I took it for myself as well, where we would have, by this stage of the year, we would have already moved on with so much other work, and now we've been held up by having to come back constantly and reevaluate and reanalyze, and they've had to rewrite 3 budget documents and all the accompanying documents. I can't even imagine what other work they would have gotten done by this time of the year in previous years. So I'm sure provincial departments are very happy that they don't need to to redo the entire budget process. It obviously costs a lot of money as well, which is a major issue that I'm very surprised we did not hear more about. But maybe we'll raise that in the next iteration, touching wood that that's not the case. But yeah.
Anlu, I'm just going to stick with you on the state-owned entities. So for me, I mean, an axe to grind is always with Transnet, given the impediment that it is on the country's economy. Talking about debt relief, bailouts, those are the usual, that's the terminology we're used to with South Africa's SOEs. What did this budget tell us, if anything specific, around our two biggest SOEs, but maybe some others? The post office is consistently in need of assistance. It's not an SOE as such, but the South African National Defence Force, we've seen how they've been exposed due to partly caused by a lack of funding and support. Yeah, what can you tell us on SOEs and where the Treasury is holding the line on making them a bit more fit for purpose?
Well, let's start with the Defence Force. They initially, over the medium term, had a 5 billion rand budget, or allocation at least, and they've now decreased that to only 3 billion rand. And that was supposed to go out in this year. It was supposed to only be a 1.8 billion rand, but they've now decided to use that entire 3 billion rand to use it for this financial year, and allocate it towards getting those troops out of the DRC. Which it's a topic for another day. I won't go into it too much, just the budget side of it. They've now decreased that by 2 billion rand. And then to get to SOEs, I mean, I'm constantly reminded when I think of SOEs of just what Minister Godongwana said back in, I think, 2021. He's repeated it many times since, but we need to practice tough love. And we need to stop this daddy must help us mentality. But if we see they follow through rate, and you mentioned, I think, holding the rope or some metaphor for it, but they've really not been doing very well with it. Since 2013, there's roughly 770 billion rand approved towards SOEs, and that's excluding any government guarantees, which, it will send that through the roof. If you consider Eskom, listeners will have to excuse me. There was not a lot of time between the actual delivery and this and Trump, and there's a lot going on. So we'll have to have a closer look at whether there's a specific bailout that they mentioned. But from the get-go, I didn't notice anything. There's nothing that caught my attention. For Eskom, just a bit of context perhaps can always be useful. To date, conditions for a 254 billion rand bailout was that they have to concession their tongue twister, their coal-fired power stations. And that has not happened. And that's an excellent example of how they've received the money, but they haven't been able to actually meet the agreements that they had. And it might have to turn into a loan and repay it. And it's just a big gemors, to use a lovely Afrikaans word for it. For Transnet, we've seen just the cost of logistical issues in the country. There's a 50 billion rand infrastructure backlog, and there's at least we recall over December, I think it was 47 billion rand that government already paid out to them. And they need an additional 70 billion rand. But yeah, to sum it up, at least in this budget, there was no immediate massive bailouts. So yeah, we do of course have the issue that Transnet mentioned, I think last week, 3 days ago in this week, when they mentioned that they have cash flow for like the next 3 months. So there's a very, very serious issue in that. And I was surprised to not see, obviously it was short notice, I'm assuming for Treasury as well. But we'll see whether there's any communication in the next couple of days or weeks on that matter. I don't see where the budget will come from, but we also can't afford to not.
Perhaps with President Ramaphosa just having arrived to the White House, maybe part of that, if there's a deal, maybe it would be around really ramping up South African mineral exports to the US, because that could be one sort of cash injection, never mind for Treasury, but for Transnet, if they can get some of that benefit, that revenue from that kind of thing. But let's see how that whole story develops. We've got a few more comments and questions flowing in. Only you touched on the Transnet point, another question from Dirk. Thanks very much, Dirk. On any commitment to cutting the civil service or freezing pay increases. We've got, of course, the public sector wage bill, along with the debt servicing costs, I think, weighing quite heavily on South Africa's fiscus. Any indication on the civil service, Anlu?
No, and that's what I tried to touch on in my last comment on the budget presentation, is that the minister made a point of it to say that there's a three-factor approach that they'll take going into this financial year and also the next budget. And the first part of it is spending efficiently, making sure that they have the spending reviews, but they didn't use the word review, and that's the entire problem with it. It's spending efficiencies, and then to increase revenue collection as the second one. And the problem with that is that they're not committing to cutting things like the civil service. We have a wonderful graph. If you don't mind, can I pull that up quickly? On the civil service, just compared to other countries. Our behind-the-scene technician will just have to give me a hand here. I will pull it up and then I will share my screen. It's worth it, the 1 second. Chris, can you see my screen?
We can, yeah. You're just not in presenter mode, but it's not, yeah. So we've got the graph. Yeah.
Is it okay? I hope so. I'll pull it up big. So yeah, if you just have a look at this is South Africa. It's for 2022, but that's the latest comparison to the rest of the countries. To compare to OECD countries, you can very clearly see that here on the orange line, that's your OECD average. That's at 10.7%, and we are currently at 13.6%. And I will not be surprised if that's bigger by now than it was in 2022. So no, there's no indication. We still have for the you can stop sharing. Thank you, Mbali. There's no indication that they, in the near future, will consider that as a cut. We see them prioritizing frontline workers, and frontline workers, of which many, actually most of them, will be part of the civil service.
Very good. Nick, coming back to you, if you were sitting, I don't know, in Minister Godongwana's shoes, maybe one of his deputies, let's say that the GNU has very limited capital to expend, political capital in its current sort of iteration. To get things going from a growth point of view and to help, of course, with the debt burden, where do you think some of those easier wins could be versus the more difficult wins? So we've got, from a liberally principled point of view, you've got hard items that you want in terms of reform. Do you think those should just be stuck to from a DA point of view, from other parties' point of view? Or do you think there are other areas of overlap where, let's assume the GNU runs out by the next local government elections? That should happen at the end of next year, at the earliest, at the beginning of 2027 at the latest. What advice would you have, or what instructions would you give to your sort of minions if you were in that position?
It's a difficult one to deal with because many of the problems now have become hard problems. Do you want to fire staff, for example? Then you're angering entrenched civil servants. Do you want to change this budget? Then you're upsetting that interest group there. So I don't think we're at the, with the difficult fiscal position, we're not really at the point where there's too many easy options left. Then you look at the state of the country. There was just this horrifying stat over the past couple of days that so far this year, there's been a very significant increase in the number of children dying from malnutrition in South African hospitals, or at least as an underlying cause of their deaths has been malnutrition. And there's been a 25% increase in malnutrition cases, I believe, in the last 5 years. So the country is really kind of running out of runway. So I think that the sort of time for slow walking things is very much past. But that being said, I think cutting regulatory burden is very important. There's a lot of industries, I think, that government has tried to sort of micromanage with all sorts of economic plans. And you've seen a little bit of that from outside the trade and industry, from the trade and industry and competition department there, like getting rid of some of the competition rules around, for example, the sugar industry. these are sort of positive steps, but they're all very small. I think one of the key things to do right now is to stop implementing some of the legislation that's either just been signed into law or is coming down the track. Stop doing more damage, I think, is the first thing. So, for example, the weakening of property rights that happens in the expropriation bill. The expropriation bill should be amended so that it's not so vague, so that it doesn't allow expropriation without compensation. And also so that it makes the process more fair for those whose property is expropriated. You also, shouldn't be trying to ram through these micromanaging regulations when it comes to employment equity, which are just going to raise the costs of doing business and just burden the country with more kind of dysfunction and running after pleasing regulators rather than actually making money. So I think there's sort of 1,000 little items that you could start off with, but if you don't start tackling some of those big ones, like the big impediments to growth, those being in labor regulations, for example, or in things like safety and security, you are not going to make the kind of progress we need to see. The human cost of South Africa's slow economic growth and bad fiscal position is felt every day. And since COVID, when our financial position worsened significantly, I think the time that sort of clock started ticking for South Africa, that we're no longer able to sort of just kind of dribble the ball. We actually have to score a goal now.
Thank you very much, Nick. We are at the 50-minute mark. Usually with these briefings, we run for about an hour. I am keeping an eye on another tab on my Chrome here, one of many, where they've gone live now to discussing various points between Trump and Ramaphosa. So I do want to allow you, Nick, Anlu, and of course everyone in attendance to go and follow that live. Let's see exactly how it goes. I've seen smiles and sort of crinkled eyes, so I'm guessing lots of jokes being cracked. Let's see if that holds or not. But I'm gonna end us a little bit early, just so that we can all get to following that and seeing what actually comes from that meeting. Anlu and Nick, I'm very sorry to cut you both short here, because I'm sure you have yet more insights to share with us, but we are going to wrap it up there. If there are any follow-up questions, apologies that we didn't get to them. We are available via email. Please get in touch with me, Chris, at cra-sa.com. To all of you, our clients who joined us this evening, thank you very much for your greatly valued support of the CRA. If you are not yet a client of the CRA, please do get in touch with me and we can discuss those details with you soonest. We're going to end it there. Have a great evening, everyone. Follow the meeting at the White House, and let's see where the Rand is against the dollar tomorrow morning. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.